I'd like to start by thanking Ingsoc for even suggesting that we have this lecture today, and even more so for suggesting that we make it a fundraising event, right? This was utterly their idea. So thank you for that marvelous, very generous notion. It's very much appreciated. Now, I should also give you a bit of a language warning about this presentation. If you haven't had me as a professor before, seen me lecture, there's some cussing in some of the stuff that we talk about. I'm going to play some clips that are might be a bit graphic, so just so you know what's coming. Now, I want to begin with Ukraine. Now, I know it's weird because, again, Black Lives Matter. What's that to do with Ukraine? Just follow me here. Now, the current war is part of a long history of assaults and genocidal attacks on Russia's part, including Holdomor's famine, which is also known as the Red Famine in 1932. In general, under Russian rule, Ukraine has suffered from poverty, destitution of resources, and various cultural assaults. Now, Russia, if you haven't been following recent news, continues to and has historically always provided a rationale for these assaults. Generally, it's along the lines of a failure to recognize and abide by legislation and dominant cultural practice. So, for instance, the Red Famine was explained as Stalin's punishment of Ukraine for failing to abide by the push for collectivization and move towards communist economy. Ukrainians dare to insist their own language and learn their own history. They became pro-democracy towards the end of the 20th century. And its resources and industry on the whole are extremely important to the making and maintenance of the Russian Empire. And for this, they are targeted. So why start with Russia and Ukraine? Well, one, the rise of television alongside the Cold War in the 1960s greatly contributed to the success of the U.S. civil rights movement in that era. Indeed, it was because of the Cold War and televised protesters and the assaults that they were incurring at the hands of U.S. officers that U.S. politicians started to rethink some of the civil rights legislation and grant some equality for African Americans. Why? Russia was saying, why would you want America to be your world leader? Look at how they treat their own people. Really? This is what you want? But at the same time, Ukraine is also an excellent example of the methods, goals, and extreme outcomes of necropolitics are concerned for today. Now, I can also give you numerous other examples of necropolitics in recent history. So, for instance, the Syrian refugee crisis, China's attack on the Uyghurs, or even when we think about immigrants within our own Western nation states. These are all groups who have been viciously subjected to biopolitics and necropolitics. In general, we rarely recognize and decry, at least for a while, the manifestations of necropolitics on global stages, while we ignore their mechanisms and outcomes at home. And this is where we come to Black Lives Matter horror. It explores the intersections and relationships between biopolitics, social death, and necropolitics. It ultimately reveals the end goals and, equally important, supposed gains of these processes for the U.S. And it explores how this violence extends from history into the present to threaten the future. And this is where I pull up this excerpt from American Gods. I should know American Gods is by no means a Black Lives Matter series. However, Orlando Jones's interventions in various episodes during the first 2 seasons of that show are really illustrative of Black Lives Matter ideology, their concerns, and their outrage at the biopolitical and necropolitical assaults that African Americans are suffering in the U.S. Now here, you have this excerpt, which Anansi is giving ship in the Middle Passage. I divide it into three parts because it illustrates, in the first, the history of Black subjugation and violation. In the second, it illustrates the present violation and subjugation, which promises to continue on endlessly into futurity unless it is resisted. Now we'll talk about the kind of violence articulated in Anansi's resistance and the re-articulation of that violence in Black Lives Matter horror film. Because when we're talking to my parents' generation, older generations, the fight for civil rights and equality tended to eschew eruptions of violence, of extreme disruption of socio-political systems. We're not seeing that same thing today, and there's a reason why. Indeed, like Anansi here, Black Lives Matter horror notes how anti-Blackness is the most American story of all. And it pauses to reflect upon our contemporary moments and its forms of resistance, even as it withholds judgment on eruptions of counter-violence against anti-Blackness. Now, I've also given you some of the exemplary films of Black Lives Matter horror, which we'll be touching upon here. This is not all of them, right? But these are the ones that are most recognizable as they've been the most popular. So Get Out, Lovecraft Country, Them, First Purge, Candyman, Two Distant Strangers, which is also available on Netflix at the moment. Now, I should also note, while we're talking about film today, Black Lives Matter horror also extends into the literary tradition. So we might talk about novels such as The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle, or Ghost Boys by Jewel Hope Gomez, right? Among numerous others. Now, I want to briefly go over some of the tropes of Black Lives Matter horror. And as I go through these, think about these horror films from this list which you recognize. Because I think you'll readily acknowledge most of these tropes. See how they manifest in the films. It's just we don't really pause to think about it. First off, each film has an isolated hero, heroine, or isolated communities. Often, these are individuals who are isolated among a populace. So they're isolated among a sea of alienating whiteness. They're not really alone, but they're positioned as if they're alone. Occasionally, these people are part of a larger group or a collective, which is equally marked out, isolated from the rest of its city or its region. This invites, when we talk about larger isolated collectives and groups, these moments also tend to invite meditations on intra-racial oppression and the ways that individuals participate in systematic oppression and structures of violence. Quite often, Black Lives Matter horror tends to be set in real places or generally recognizable spaces around the US. So for instance, First Purge is set in Staten Island. Two Distant Strangers is set in New York City. Lovecraft Country is set in Chicago, as well as other places. Them is set in Oakland. I could keep going. The choice to set our films in named and recognizable locales acts to really stress the uncanniness of the U.S. landscape for African Americans. In this way, they recall Toni Morrison's comment in Beloved in the voice of Baby Suggs. Right? You remember she says, there ain't a house in this country ain't packed to its rafters with some dead Negro's grief. And what's important in terms of the setting is how it extends that reason, not just beyond the South into the North, but also to the West, to the Midwest, locations we tend not to think about in terms of racial violence and racial injustice. But they too are as marred by the blood tide as the explicitly racist, exceptionalist U.S. South. As such, they remind us that, for instance, Wall Street began its days as a stock exchange of a peculiar sort it was a slave market. Chicago was home to one of the bloodiest anti-Black race riots, and Oakland began as a primarily white suburb that was subjected to violent integration that resulted in lots of bloodshed. Quite often, their monster is actually human. They're a signifier, thus, of white oppressors and systemic injustice. But even when the monster is actually a creature, they're simply tools of white supremacy and villainy, right? And so we might say that the monstrous creature is just a metaphor for the dumbfounding mechanisms and perpetuation of white systemic domination and violence. Really, though, at the heart of each text and film is a sense that oppressive whiteness is the true and ultimate monstrosity. Alongside this, the violence that we see represented and depicted in all of these texts is not imagined, but always a reproduction from history and recent events. Right? So if we think about Get Out, for example, there's always metaphorization of the slave auction block, of the medical experiments on African Americans. If we think about Two Distant Strangers, what we see repeated in Carter's death are the various recent assaults on police against Black victims, from choking to shooting to, well, outright home invasion. Lastly, these films embrace anti-terrorist violence, and that's one of the important parts of Black Lives Matter horror, because they insist that these assaults on Black lives in America is a kind of terrorism. Now, this is actually a fairly inflammatory statement to say, given that it was only within the last 5-10 years that we've been willing to call the Ku Klux Klan terrorist organization. And so, for Black Lives Matter to insist on this violence as a kind of terrorist attack that's been permissible across the ages of American history is to make a profound statement about American sociopolitics. What's also important, though, is that this violence, this anti-terrorist violence, is never joyfully embraced. Our protagonist always starts as non-violent figures who seek to avoid conflict. Again, think about Chris and Get Out, right? The way the Armitage family ask him all such a question as in goading him to act physically. Think even about Andre at the beginning of that film, who, realizing he's being followed, turns around to avoid conflict and walks the other way. What these films insist, though, is that we may try to avoid as much as we want, but conflict is coming for us. That this is a confrontation that we can't avoid. Even as it's something that's utterly undesirable. So let's think about some of the ways, some of the theories which Black Lives Matter horror really talks about, right? It really deals with biopolitics, social death, and necropolitics, as I mentioned. What Black Lives Matter horror also shows us is that these work simultaneously to achieve the figurative death of Blacks before their actual death. Now, biopolitics is simply and horrifically the mechanism which fosters some life, largely white elite life, and disallows other life to the point of death. It is quite simply the notion that some folk are not just lesser, but are drains upon our socioeconomic systems. And thus, aid to them is not a help to them, but a harm to us. The best example I can give of this is the establishment of urban ghettos and its eventual gentrification. Candyman talks about this quite marvelously in the recent film, and saying, who do you think makes the hood? The city cuts off the community and waits for it to die. That's biopolitics. Passive, aggressive, death dealing to a population you deem unworthy. They then invite developers in and say, hey, you artists, you young people, you white preferably or only, please come to the hood. It's cheap. And if you stick it out for a couple of years, we'll bring you a Whole Foods. In other words, it's a politics of disposability. The people that live there do not deserve to retain that property, are merely placeholders for further development by more worthy individuals. As such, nation states do not deem themselves responsible for extending sanctity of life protection to these populations. So I want to call your attention in one example that always distresses me whenever I watch the video of this or just see this picture, to this image in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. I don't know if you can make out, but amongst this family, who was stopped by cops, mind you, they're in a minivan leaving a mall, and they're stopped on suspicion of having stolen the minivan. Really, a minivan. But amongst this family that's being arrested is a little 6-year-old girl. I don't know if you can make her out in the crown. She's wearing a little pink crown there. The cops not only forced her to lie on the ground, but actually handcuffed this child. This is a recent example of anti-Black violence and biopolitical ideology that renders Blacks lesser subhuman non-citizens. Right? I can tell you stories of other young Black children who have been arrested in school for throwing a tantrum, not to mention those that have been shot. It's more than just Tamir Rice. That list is long. These children are not deemed worth protecting because they're not fully human, they're not citizen. In the case when death results, the victims are often killed twice. Their actual death is followed by a figurative post-mortem murder of their humanity. Right? So again, think about the Candyman. Right? He explicitly articulates that. For the longest time, the ending of that movie baffled me. Right? He says, now as Candyman, they will say, I have shed innocent blood, but you are far from innocent. It's that first part. What do you mean, Candyman? Why are you telling us that they're going to call you a monster? Why do you say that? Really, what he's doing is, what the film is doing in that moment, is reasserting how the victims of anti-Blackness are murdered, not just in actual death, but also then in how they're remembered, and how that death is reviewed and replayed on the news. And thus, Candyman's comment in some ways reflects, for instance, the kind of media autopsy that was done for George Floyd. Well, he cashed a bad check. He was trying to pass a bad bill. The kind of autopsy that was done for Michael Brown, well, he was large and hulking. He seemed frightening. For Eric Garner, he was selling illegal cigarettes. Clearly, he had it coming. The investigation into all the ways in which they made mistakes in that moment of their death and in their lives leading up to it, to highlight all of their flaws and dismiss the extent to which they're victims. These moments also reveal the extent, and biopolitics reveals the extent to which futurity is extended to white subjects only. Non-whites are disqualified from full humanity and from forward-oriented agency. Instead, non-white bodies, as being backwards, are confined to zones of death and sacrifice in the service to white futurity. Again, think of Anthony's fate in Candyman, right? Candyman, for those of you that have followed the series, Anthony arrives first in the 1992 Candyman as an infant who is meant to be slaughtered and sacrificed. And by 2021, we learn that his destiny as a sacrifice is still in motion. He's still doomed. And the question is, why? Well, the film isn't saying Anthony is special. He's just one of hundreds upon thousands. We might also think about this in terms of Chris's and Tick's fate in Get Out and Lovecraft Country, both of which are explicitly sacrifice and sacrificial figures for white futures and white improvement. Now, closely linked to biopolitics is social death, as well as necropolitics. Necropolitics is really just a more active iteration of biopolitics in fostering death among certain populations. Now, social death is always at play in biopolitics. It is the complete alienation of the individual from human existence, even as they continue to live. It denies them individuation and identity, denies them stable relationships like family and a stable community. It is a displacement from society. It leads to social exclusion, loss of citizenship, of economic capital, and of access to resources. Ultimately, it's a loss of cultural capital and connection that occurs across generations. Now, our most common metaphor for social death historically has been the voodoo zombie, right, which is the figure on the right side. But that's been displaced by a new zombie, right, the social zombie. That figure which is still denied agency and will of their own, which moves through life and existence with silence at the command of someone else's. And so I give you again, Andre, who's now at this point Get Out, Logan. Also notable about that shift in name, he's repeating the performance of the enslaved, right? Of the subjugation of the enslaved, in which they did not choose their own name, but the names were changed. The voodoo zombie Haitian myth is a metaphor for the horrors of perpetual enslavement in perpetuity, even beyond death. There's no escaping this. And so, in the voodoo zombie, Haiti has already imagined generations, actually centuries, before we arrive at a current moment, the mechanisms of social death. In the voodoo zombie, they already predicted the state of Black peoples in Western nation states around the world. And again, social death is exemplified in all of our films by the public nature of the character's isolation and suffering. Carter is one of the best examples of this in Two Distant Strangers. That man is killed on a public street multiple times. By the end of the film, we know he's died 100 times. Most of them in public, and no one sees. That is social death, that level of utter invisibility and lack of empathy for your suffering. Now, necropolitics, like I said, is a more active form of biopolitics in the ways it fosters death among populations. And what really exemplifies, the film that perfectly exemplifies this, is the First Purge, right? So I'm going to play for you the trailer to that movie, just so you can get a sense.
Citizens, this will be a tradition we celebrate every year. Join First Purge.
Isaiah, come say bye.
What do you think, sis?
Always.
See you tonight.
People are now calling this controversial experiment a legalized crime, the purge.
When I say just stay with me doing the purge.
Oh, it's gonna be fun now.
We are here with Dr. May Updale. She came up with this experiment. Is the purge a political device?
It is a psychological one. If we want to save our country, we must release all our anger in one night.
Tonight, we'll see the good and evil in everyone.
This is for emergency broadcast system announcing the commencement of the First Purge.
higher level of participation.
Human nature does not obey the laws of politics.
What the hell is going on?
The old ex-military, something funky going down, dude.
You send your soldiers into the island disguised as citizens.
This country needs for this to work.
No one's coming to help us. After tonight, nothing will ever be the same again.
They forgot about one thing. They forgot about us.
All right. Sorry for some of those subtitles. You never trust YouTube's subtitling function. Now, a couple of things in that excerpt, in that trailer, in terms of how it connects to the ideas of necropolitics. One, they note, citizens, this will be a tradition we celebrate every year. Is this purge a political device? It's a psychological one. That's necro economy, even as it's an acknowledgement of the ways in which anti-Black violence is a sacrificial mechanism for the whole of the country's benefits. Right? We don't know what this refers to. Within the context of this film, it might just be the slaughter of impoverished Black communities on a regular year, on an annual basis. And that this then is psychological warfare to control these communities and others like it. There's also the element of population confinement. I couldn't quite see it there, but the focus of this entire film is on Staten Island as an area of violent death. And at the very beginning of this film, when it opens, it has already been subject to a kind of quarantine. It has become an entirely gated city that no one can leave, much less enter. And then there's a large-scale production of death, right? As Dimitri notes, our neighborhood is under siege by a government who doesn't give a shit about any of us. Additionally, that service announcement that all emergency services will be suspended, right? That's large-scale productions of death. Now, equally important, populations are taught to accept this violence and ignore the obvious humanity and rights of those who are targeted in a number of ways. The first is through sanctioned and regularized terror. We see this in the States in terms of, for instance, the stop and searches that tend to target non-white communities in particular. And again, the opening to the First Purge as a no-go, Staten Island as a no-go area, is another articulation of this sanctioned violence, right? What we see in that opening is not only Staten Island has been highly gated, but also over-policed by cops who are carrying very large guns. What also happens is a legitimization of violence by private individuals. Now, this could be individual officers or private citizens claiming self-defense, as we've seen in some U.S. cases. But when we think about this in film, and again, thinking about the film as referencing actual historical moments, Them is another excellent illustration, the series that's on Amazon Prime. Because what we see there is a Black family under assault by white neighbors who weirdly are constantly calling the cops on the very people they're victimizing. No surprise the cops take the neighbor's side. This legitimization of violence by private individuals is literally the subject of almost every episode of Lovecraft Country, where its characters are targeted by wealthy and elite magicians, angry cops, and private citizens, especially when we talk about the episodes on Emmett Till and Rewind Tulsa 1921. Necropolitics also includes the predation of natural resources. And again, when we have these locations set in an urban inner city or ghetto spaces, there are an emphasis on how this predation occurs without us even really noticing it. There's an absolute lack of resources marking U.S. ghettos. Again, Anthony already pointed this out for us in Candyman. But we think about even our low-income, highly minority areas here in the UK as well as the US. There's common features, right? There's no banks, any ATMs, usually hard to be when they're free elsewhere. There's very few medical clinics. There's few grocery stores offering fresh veggies and food. Instead, there's a preponderance of cheap fast food restaurants. Right. This too proves a part of part 4, which is various modes of killing, right? The ways in which this predation of resources is another form of murder. Death by McDonald's, you might say. We see this again in First Purge, right? In which that announcement of the suspicion of emergency services actually is an allusion to a reality in most U.S. ghettos, which is if you're having a medical emergency, you're going to have a hell of a time getting the ambulance out. The cops come with equipment, but an ambulance, that might take hours for it to arrive. And then there's the moral justification, right? And this is essentially just victim blaming. We see this in terms of the criminalization of non-white populations, of notions. We see this in notions of the intellectual and supposed emotional inferiority. Mark exemplifies this in his first attack on Carter in Two Distant Strangers, right? The reason he assaults and stops Carter in the first place, Carter is smoking what Merck calls a funny cigarette. Now, it really is a hand-rolled cigarette, but Merck uses it as an excuse to stop and interrogate Carter further. And this leads to death. Why does he stop and look so closely at that funny cigarette? Because there's already this moral justification of blacks as a criminal body, as not so much a victim, but a victimizer waiting to strike. And there's someone to be taken down before they take someone else out. Equally important is thinking about what's won through biopolitics and necropolitics. And it's important to consider this because maybe it'll help us explain why Americans held on to these politics with such a death threat. I mean, it's the 21st century. Why are we still doing this? There has to be something at stake beyond just maintaining the status quo. If we were so concerned with the status quo, we would never worry about progress on any level. So what is gained through black assaults, through this violent anti-Blackness? Well, again, I think our text posits a few answers. One is entertainment. Right? We see this again in the First Purge, which, is broadcast across news channels across the nation. We see this in Candyman in terms of the art critic who suddenly takes an interest in Anthony's work. We also see this in Two Distant Strangers, and Merck is an excellent example of this. I'll play you this clip. It's very short, but also a great critique.
I would say, see you next time, but I fucking hope not. Thanks for the ride, Officer Murray.
Take care of yourself, kid. Bravo! one, like, whew, the way you're all charming and trying to appeal to my better nature as a human being and shit, that was primo. You're never short on courage, kid. Only time. I mean, sometimes you run, most times you fight. One of the guys chokes you out a wee bit too much. This one, my friend, this one was a noble performance. Best of the bunch. It was my goddamn favorite. Best of the bunch! Whoa! Best of the bunch! Whoa! The best of the bunch!
All right, now I started that clip a few bits before Merck's celebration, in part because I wanted you to hopefully catch the script on Merck's car, his police car, right? Did any of you catch what was written there? Maybe know what was there. It said, courtesy, respect, professionalism. All the things which Merck was not in that moment. There's numerous times in which you see this script appearing on Merck's car in this series, right? You call attention to the ways in which, while that might be the rule for police interaction with certain citizens, it's not necessarily how they interact with all. That save, that courtesy, that respect, that professionalism is saved for certain people. And so, it really reflects on the contradictions inherent in the police shootings, inherent in Merck's behavior, and it really reminds us what's being insisted upon in the Black Lives Matter protests. Also important there is the song. I know the song is a little cheesy, but it didn't film, so give us some license there. But it's words itself, you're not alone, right? It actually stands out to me because one of the points of using anti-Black violence and suffering as entertainment is that it distracts from the need for large socioeconomic reform by insisting that this violence is limited to interactions between terrified cops and an illegible, terrifying Black population. But that's not true, right? Again, we opened this by thinking about how biopolitics and necropolitics appears not just across different global locations, but even within the same Western countries. And so you might consider how the biopolitics, biological reduction of Blacks to non-citizens and subhuman in the U.S. is replicated in U.S. treatment of South American immigrants and asylum seekers. Right? It is replicated in the treatment of the extremely impoverished, regardless of their race. It is replicated in the treatment of trans individuals. So yes, it's a distraction to focus on anti-Blackness as just a kind of entertainment, a talking point in the media. Right? Now, the extent to which it is entertainment, we might say as apparent in how it serves as talking points for the news, largely until something else comes along to distract us. So, for instance, consider the horrible coverage of Michael Brown's corpse, who we were allowed to watch lying under a sheet in the street for hours, the repeated circulation of George Floyd's strangulation. It's a thin line between witnessing and outcrying, or decrying against violence, and between that and morbid curiosity. And Black Lives Matter horror is really challenged with walking that thin line, trying to articulate the horror of the witness in a way that recounts that violence while also disrupting the morbid curiosity. And so it attempts to re-emphasize the violence, not as talking points, not as entertainment, not as something to tweet about, but as a horrifying outcome of monstrous villainy. Now, we don't have time in the lecture to discuss how Black Lives horror to achieve this end. And the significance that's been arising, of the accusations that have been arising of Black Lives Matter horror as a kind of Black trauma horror. But if you have questions about that, we can certainly get to it in the Q&A. Also important are the ways in which these politics help to establish and police boundaries around the normative citizen and the criminal excessive alien. And in doing so, in establishing these boundaries, it discourages coalition politics. It discourages revolution by marking blacks as a disposable other, a victim who's always to blame for their own suffering and death. And again, it also implies that black struggle is not the struggle of Americans. Rather, anti-black violence is somehow supposedly separate from the rest of U.S. socio-political economy. Now again, Black Lives Matter horror keeps countering this idea. Right? So when we look at, I think it's episode 8 of Them, what does that episode start with? It starts with an explanation of the entire history of redlining and its contributions to American economy and the manipulation of regions and neighborhoods. Lastly, these mechanisms maintain white supremacy largely for elites and wealthy whites. And indeed, functions 1 and 2 are highly profit-making. Right, so again, we see this in terms of how Get Out starts it's about a stock market sale of black bodies. Them really emphasizes and drives home the power and profit of the bankers who are manipulating housing prices and regional development. Lovecraft Country is pretty damn explicit in its metaphorization about how anti-Blackness functions as a profit-making point for whites, right? Their Tick and its community are caught primarily in a class struggle, a struggle that's as much about power as it is about money between wealthy, elite whites and middle-class white cops. But at the same time, we will talk about this as maintaining white supremacy, are the ways in which it also maintains, these mechanisms maintain white political supremacy. By maintaining a population which is always a threat, a point of terror that must be guarded against, and proving yourself a successful guardian, you maintain authority. It's a divide and conquer strategy. And again, First Purge links this evidence. Right? The origins of the Purge itself is a group called the New Founding Fathers, who are not a very thinly veiled metaphor for Trump's election. The last thing I want to comment on is the nature of the resistance. Because these films acknowledge that violence is the literal, logical response to being consistently ignored and disenfranchised for generations by a country that refuses to recognize you as a human, much less a citizen. And so I wanted to think about this not just in terms of contemporary positioning, but also in terms of a previous era in which we saw profound violence against Black Americans who were just fighting for equality and the right to live. Martin Luther King comments on the rationale for riots. We drew a distinction, an important distinction, between violence against people, which he deemed unjust, and violence against property. Indeed, he asks, really, what's more important, protecting the person who's suffering right next to you, or protecting yourself? As such, he viewed riots as the product of an unjust social order.
I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. What is it that America has failed to hear It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.
And so, like Martin Luther King, Black Lives Matter organizers and protesters don't advocate for eruptions of violence, and yet when it comes, they don't necessarily say it's unjustified. There's a rationale. There's a long history of violence and oppression that's erupting in these moments of extremely chaotic protests and rioting. Black Lives Matter horror observes these same principles, noting how blacks, having been positioned as lesser objects who are readily cold for generations, for hundreds of years at this point, how this might lead to violence. And doing so, it also returns us to a readily recognizable Gothic and horror trope. Man's failure to progress, right, despite our pretensions otherwise. And we quite often see this trope appearing in sci-fi and apocalyptic horror films. Right? Think Frankenstein, for instance, how that's about the pretensions of progress by a man who is still very messed up and has some outdated ideologies that he needs to fix. In our modern era, it quite often appears in terms of apocalyptic sci-fi. And thus, in using this trope and thinking about Black Lives Matter as also the horror of man's failure to progress, we might think about it as also kind of apocalyptic fiction. Now, I will remind you of the meaning of apocalypse. Right? It doesn't just mean destruction and devastation, it means a revelation. And thus, the fight for Black life is made apocalyptic, stressing the need for a change that should have come generations ago. It also notes that violence in some way is not just inevitable, given its delay, but it is also in a way necessary. Now, how is it necessary? The whole idea of a revolution, of a systemic change, of a structural overhaul, is in and of itself a kind of violence. It's a disruption. It's a destruction of an old way of being, an old way of life. That doesn't mean it has to be accompanied by actual physical violence. It's just unfortunate in the US, historically, that tends to be how it's going. But systemic overhaul itself is painful, is difficult. It's one of the reasons why we're so resistant to it. So we might think of gun violence two ways, both literally as the inevitable conflict, the inevitable consequence of delayed progress, and as metaphorically, as a consequence, as disruption and pain that arises from any change, no matter how necessary it is. We need these resolutions, this radical, painful change, if we are to continue into tomorrow. Thus, the true horror of the subgenre stems from 2 points. One is the necessity of such radical violence in the 21st century. We shouldn't be here. We shouldn't need this at this time. We shouldn't be fighting this fight. But the second horror is that we don't know what tomorrow will bring. Black Lives Matter horror is very much informed by the hope and the disappointments of the 1960s civil rights era. An era that seemed to promise equality finally. It brought us the end of segregation. It brought us seeming equality for African Americans, the end of housing covenants, of targeted racist violence. It brought with it a seeming insistence on protecting Black life. And within 20 years, we saw that being rolled back until we are in the place where we are now, with Black violence, anti-Black violence, appearing regularly as news clips. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. And this is a horror, because at the end of each film, each text, the hero and heroine survive, but we never see what their tomorrow might be. They may have survived today, just so that they can continue fighting on the next day, the next week, month, year. Thank you. So I think we have a little bit of time if there's any questions or any comments. I know I went through a lot. I know it wasn't the largest of topics, but I think it's an important discussion to have. So any questions? Any thoughts? Yeah?
Could you talk a little bit more about the accusation of black trauma porn?
Okay, so we saw this accusation pop up first with Lovecraft Country, particularly in the episodes Rewind Tulsa 1921, in which the characters were cast back into the Tulsa Massacre to witness for themselves. We've seen this in other Black Lives Matter horror films, so we see it with them. Them got a ton of it, right? And most people say that them, what made it pornographic was the scene of Lucky's rape and the slaughter of her infants. But it's not a valid critique. If you watch the scene, you don't actually see nearly as much as we see in some other fairly gratuitous, even metaphorical sexualized rape violence, right? The hair turns away, you wash your face, you don't see much else. We don't see literally her child's body being pulled to pieces, right? We just know what's happening. So really, that question, an accusation of these scenes as Black trauma porn, for me at least, really articulate a desire not to have to see and confront, right? Because porn we always take as excess, as too much, right? As fetish because of its excess. But these scenes quite often are simply showing us what we already have seen or should have seen if we studied history. By that logic then, newspaper coverage of, for instance, lynchings in the 1900s are kind of trauma porn. But that's what happens. Right? That's what people were encountering and celebrating on the streets. So then how can you say any reproduction of this violence in film is pornographic when it's simply a reproduction of what has historically occurred? Right? That accusation for me is simply saying, like, y'all are making us watch something, see something, and confront something we really don't want to think about, we don't want to know about, we don't want to have to see. Right? Especially in America, the easiest way to get something censored is called pornography. Oh, that's kind of porn. It's fetishistic. Put it away. And worse is done under the pretense of being for the good of the very group that's trying to articulate its violence, victimization. Articulate its violation. So it's saying, look, for your own sake, don't show us this about what you've been through. But really, whose sake is it for? Right? The victim who's already suffered it. Those of us who know this history. Or for the person, for the population that doesn't want to have to confront it. Right? The other thing for me about that accusation is it points to, and we discussed this last week, an element of how we might see what's happening in these films as an expression of what Robert Solomon calls real horror. Right? I mentioned that in the lecture. Robert Solomon says real horror is not pleasurable. Real horror is distressing, is upsetting, is not something you seek out, it's something that erupts and comes upon you, regardless of whether or not you want it. And as a consequence, it haunts, it disturbs, it throws into chaos your sense of the world and how it functions, and leaves you amazed. So then, when we have these accusations of this is just too pornographic, I can't look, you shouldn't look, that kind of disdain and distress for me suggests that, hey, look, they've done it. They reproduced this violence as a kind of real horror. It means that we want to turn away from it instead of rewinding and rewatching it time and time again, right? Because there's something for me that's different. I have to wonder, when they make these accusations, why is it they don't say this like news sources, but they keep replaying Black victims in the moments of their deaths? I seem like there was a couple weeks there where I couldn't get away from watching George Floyd be strangled. That's porn. Right? Especially when we consider the narrative that went with it. Right? It was a narrative of, well, the cop was afraid. Floyd had this coming. Look, the cop is saying this using this as a lesson to future Black criminals. Don't do this or this will come for you. He's doing a good job. Right? People didn't turn away from that as much as they want to turn away from what we're seeing in terms of the horror films. Right? So that's another important difference for me. Okay? Thanks. Any other questions? Yeah.
I think this is kind of a follow-on as well, but you said a few times that there's been different times where sort of thinly veiled metaphors were used by various kind of directors in different films. Do you think that is specifically used to address that kind of gulf between two sides of society in which, even though the people that can identify don't need such a thinly veiled metaphor and view it so thinly veiled, because the kind of hegemonic side of the society is so willfully ignorant, the directors are still pushed towards that kind of very thin veiling? Yeah,
I think so, right? The veiling makes it more palatable. So, for instance, to go back to the question of the accusation of Black horror, Peel's films don't get these accusations. Why? They're heavily metaphorical. They allow us enough intellectualization of the violence that we can stand at a remove and ponder what it might actually be representing. The thinner that veil is, the more distressing it is. Right? Now, we've seen this previously with another film genre, torture porn. Right? There's some films which there's not really a metaphor at all. It's just an outright reproduction of the kinds of violence we saw in the media. Those got the worst ratings. Because it forces us to look head on without any intermediary the things, the sins we were committing. We don't like that. So yeah, I think that thin veil is necessary just to even get it passed into film, into popular film reception. But yeah, like I said, I mean, when I think of Tulsa 1921, I don't know how many of you have seen Lovecraft Country all the way through, but that episode was just, because if you know the history of Tulsa, right, you were just watching it replay very graphically in front of you in a way that most history books didn't go into detail about. Right? Most Americans didn't even know about Tulsa until recently. And most of them still don't know the details. The same is true with Emmett Till. Right? So, that episode, which starts with Emmett Till's funeral and ends with the reenactment of Emmett Till's murder, but on the body of a white woman, that was actually a really savvy move. Right? Because what it does is it confronts the audience with the violence done to a black body, but puts it on a figure we readily decry as a victim, a petite blonde woman. We watch all of the violence that Till suffered be done to her, so that we can have that emotive reaction, but it's still distressing to people, right? But it was a way of saying that this violence is horrifying, right? How can you accept it on this body and not on that one? And I don't think folks like that question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great talk, so thanks very much. I was really interested in genre when we were talking about, and I guess I was thinking about like Fruit Pulsation or Story Body as non-horror films, but also kind of speak to the Black Lives Matter movement at the moment. So I guess I was wondering what you thought, whether like horror is a way to get these horrific feelings visible in an explicit way, and what the relationship between horror and documentary, if you really thought about that.
Yeah. Well, I think a documentary allows for a level of intellectualization, right? I think it doesn't deal as much, it forces us to really theorize and contemplate the social position, right? And the manipulations and negotiations people of color, black people have to make in terms of navigating the world. I think horror, though, again, I'm going to go back to Robert Solomon, right? Because his critique of contemporary horror films is that they don't do justice to the term horror. That when we talk about horror films, really what we're talking about is a scary film that doesn't ever fully access the emotion of horror itself. And so what I think this subgenre is doing is reattaching the emotion of horror to scenes of anti-black violence, right? To scenes of necro and biopolitics, so that we will be horrified next time we pass a ghetto that looks like Staten Island in this film. Right? So that we will be horrified rather than intrigued the next time we see the shooting death of a young black American. That we won't just take it as, oh, there's another news item. Well, this is something we must contend with as a society, but remain as an emotional remove. Right? I think it's important to reattach that emotion because, again, so many of the protesters, that emotion is always immediately attached because that can be so many of us. Right? The other thing about horror, about real horror, that Solomon points out, is that he uses 9/11 as this illustration of a point of real horror. Because for him, he said, watching the scenes of 9/11 provoked the emotional horror for me because I could imagine being there. I had been in that space previously, on those streets previously, and could imagine what it was like to be there the moment the planes hit. So then, accessing stir that emotion in your audience also means being able to stir empathy. Being able to force them to feel what it's like to be there. I think that's, again, why they focus so much on the horror genre itself. Right? There's that affect adds impetus to action. Right? When you're so shaken, you'll do anything to shake that feeling off, to get rid of it. Sometimes the only thing you do is act, stand up, speak out. Thank you. Any other questions? I think we're a little over time, but that's all. Thank you all so much for coming out. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you had, well, perhaps enjoyed isn't the word. I hope you found this engaging. And I hope it's given you some things to think about and go back and reflect on. Y'all have a good night.